A Realm Reborn is long, very long, the longest expansion in terms of quest count. It is a large commitment and overwhelming for new players to get through such a long expansion for their brand new journeys. Even after the culling in 5.3 with the removal of 51 main story quests, Heavensward, the direct sequel, has barely half the quests of its predecessor. AR is considered the great filter, weeding out the players who aren't willing to see it through. But is this how it should be? Should players be turned away at the very start of 14's expansive story? The game has grown so much over the last 13 years, to the point that the content released today feels completely separate from how ARR is presented. With such a stark difference between the two, is it valid for people to quit the whole game after their experience with something so deviant from today's gameplay? With Evercold just on the horizon, and the comments from Yoshi P in recent Q&As, the prospect of being able to skip to the present has players in fervent discussion. Is it still worth doing the expansion anymore, or is it really as bad as people seem to say and is worth being skipped over to experience what the game truly is, rather than what it used to be? In order to properly tackle this topic, two things need to be addressed. What does ARR have to offer to new players, and what would be the ramifications if players were allowed to skip over it and be dropped straight into modern content? Having done everything in ARR over the last 2 years, it's also a good opportunity for a retrospective on how ARR is as an expansion after all this time. Let's start by covering the first point. When creating a fresh character, players are dropped right into the beginning of A Realm Reborn. With the world of possibility open, it can feel overwhelming to decide what to do next. Thankfully, the main story is there to provide guidance. 14 even prides itself on the story, making it one of the core parts of its advertising, as people know it as the story MMO. Asking anybody what they think of 14 is likely heavily influenced by the story. But is it worth going through all the quests in ARR? What does it really provide? The first 15 levels of quests are entry-level tutorials. There is a brief glimpse of the Scions depending on the starting town, but most of it is running from person to person, slaying weak monster, and dealing with basic solo duties. Skipping the first 15 levels loses only a very small part of the story introduction, but none of the gameplay is really lost. The Scion helps get the player involved with the group, but that isn't really important context for future events. It feels like old MMO design, where the game holds the player's hand for far too long, keeping things oversimplified for a very extended period of time. There are some endearing characters, Mother Miyun, Momodi, and Badarin, but with so much busy work, they don't have the opportunity to flourish. After leaving the initial town, they mostly disappear from the main story. Even up to level 30 quests, the player is still mostly handling busy work, making a lot of the early game feel like filler content. In fact, a large chunk of the quest purge from 5.3 was for this section of the game, taking out 14 quests from this part alone. Things finally begin to ramp up with Titan, and the player finally gets to tackle bigger things, with the march to Kurthus and preparations for both Titan and Garuda, before assaulting the Praetorium. However, the story does lay strong groundwork for what the player can expect moving forward for fundamentals about the world and how the characters interact with each other. Being able to meet the Scions and learn about their personalities helps them develop into beloved characters, allowing the major moments that greatly impact them in the future to carry that necessary impact, like Moonbreeda's death and the Bloody Banquet. The character building is what makes the inevitable split have so much weight on the player. At the time, players had known these characters for 2 years before the end of the MSQ, leaving their fates unknown. Heavensward is seen as one of the pinnacles of 14's storytelling, and these heights were only achievable because of the groundwork laid in A Realm Reborn, carrying a great amount of the narrative weight. Harshafont's death carries the impact for people that it does strictly because of what happened in ARR, with how much he supported and helped the player during their desperate moments. Yes, this stuff is built upon in Heavensward, but without that basis, it wouldn't be as impactful. It's the first time the player truly loses a character directly important to them. Even beyond Heavensward, the Exarch reveal in Shadowbringers and Urianger's moment of grief in Endwalker are powerful because of the impact those characters had previously, which would be lost without ARR. The story from the beginning carries through a lot of what makes this game so strong narratively, and skipping ARR would greatly affect the reception of the story for the people who care about it. Talking about the ARR story could be its own whole video, so I'll stop myself for now. I feel ARR is a very important cornerstone to what makes the game amazing narratively, and is a good expansion because of it. However, there is more than just the story to any expansion. Expansions in 14 always bring with them loads of content, and ARR being the original, had a lot developed that was experimental. Despite some parts of it feeling rushed, ARR helped expand what the game is capable of today. Although FF14 is known for its story, an MMO cannot live on narrative alone. Thankfully, there is more content to do in this game. A major example of this is raiding. ARR falls into a strange category though, as, like I mentioned previously, most of the old fight design is incredibly different from present day. One of the old fights is even seen as the culmination of poor design and has led to major developments to future fight design. Having experienced all of the ARR encounters mine, minimum item level, no echo, through my series Patchlock, I feel I have a unique perspective. The Coils of Bahamut, the 8-player raid series, are the peak of ARR battle content. Notably, these 13 fights are the only non-savage raids that cannot be accessed in the Duty Finder, as they have been classified as difficult fights. They are comparable mechanically to some savage fights developed today, while some are not. T3. Most players that unlock it are told to go through them unsynced, not interacting with the battle part and experiencing them only for the story, which, in my opinion, is the best story in the entirety of ARR. If you haven't experienced them before, I extremely highly recommend it. It's really, really good. However, skipping the fights is missing a core part of 14's growth. These fights form a strong basis for mechanics that continue to be seen in modern raid design. Wild Charge, Lunar Dynamo, Iron Chariot, Meteors, Dive Bombs. These all come back in variations later, and players still refer to mechanics similar to these by these names, despite most players never having interacted with the originals. The fights are incredibly fun, mostly. As snapshots to the history of fight design, the Coils are amazing, showing just how far the designers have come in the 13 years of the game's development. It really is a shame that new players are told to skip this. They are missing out on something that was pivotal to the game. There are some ways to correct this if the developers choose to. Firstly, they could implement a lower difficulty like story mode to allow players to experience them properly rather than unsync and miss a large part of what makes them so great. We've seen what they can do with other Savage and normal splits, and the mechanics could easily translate into simpler versions without losing the heart of these fights. They could even make the story mode a solo variant, allowing the player to tackle them alone or with other NPCs that still use similar mechanics. And, you know, while they're there, they could clean up AR snapshots and the like for Twisters and Petrifaction. Just a thought. The Coils also were the first implementation of the Savage difficulty, which took the already difficult fights and cranked them up to an absurd degree. The difficulties of newer Savages have been adjusted to be not nearly as tough, but the originals set quite a precedent for what Savage difficulty could be. Having completed all of the second Coil's Savage mine, they are mostly great fights, and are great challenges for players willing to step out of their comfort zones and weather the ancient fight designs. However, they could also benefit from some minor reworking. Melusine Savage, for example, has 4 cleansable debuffs that go out every 50 seconds. Originally, Scholar could cleanse them with their fairy, but now the fight is almost forcibly restricted to double bard to ensure the cleanses can all be done cleanly. You can do it without double bard, but it makes the entirety of the fight much riskier. Cross-class also likely had some effect on the mechanics not being as tough, but as class design changed over time, these features and abilities got removed, increasing the difficulty even more as they were not designed for modern classes. Trying to do these restricted to ARR jobs and consumables added even more challenge, as White Mage is just inferior to Astrologian. But that is a tangent for another day when I get that video done. The Coils are created as the endgame for ARR, with Savage taking it to a whole other level, yet they still house some of the best battle content ARR has to offer, and skipping it would be, in my opinion, a great loss. Beyond raiding, there are other facets of the game that were introduced during ARR that still are being worked on today, and are beloved by subsets of the player base. PvP, introduced in 2.1 with the Fold and built upon further with 2.3 releasing Frontlines, is appreciated by so many players. Even though I dislike the game modes personally, there are players that engage almost exclusively with PvP. That is their whole reason for logging in and playing the game. There are even tournaments held at FanFests for Crystalline Conflict, the newest variant of the Fold. The Gold Saucer, introduced in 2.51, allows players to do a bunch of random minigames for cosmetics. Players can engage in some of their favorite pastimes. What gamers don't enjoy a fair share of gambling on cactpot tickets or chocobo races. It also has Triple Triad for players who enjoy card games, Fashion Report for those who enjoy glamour, though most of the time they end up just being puzzles that lead to some of the strangest glams, and regularly rotating gate minigames for variety or spectacles. Despite being introduced in 2.51, it is still getting updates, with a new one coming pretty soon with multiple new minigames. It is clearly a piece of content that is well loved. In 2.3, we got the Hunt, which encouraged players to work together to both spawn and take down tough marks. From its initial inception, it was always designed as a community event. A lot of people say 14 doesn't feel like an MMO, more like a story game with multiplayer content. However, the game gets close to capturing this MMO feeling when going on hunt trains with 100 other players, traveling between worlds and maps. Players have even developed their own communities for the Hunt on each data center. And as the developers are still adding S, A, and B ranks to every expansion, the Hunt is still thriving. They are also adding achievements every expansion, but considering how achievement design has been going recently in the game, you can decide if that's a good or bad thing. Hildebrand, an insane storyline that started back in 1.0, was reintroduced in ARR and is still continuing through Dawntrail now, which allows the devs to test new cutscene techniques, character movements, and animations to improve upon the story ones. It's always a fever dream to go through, and is beloved by a large part of the player base, as the characters are extremely memorable and fun to experience going through all the insanity that ensues. Another 1.0 holdover are the relic weapons, also brought back in ARR. To a lot of people, relics are the end game content, and for players who enjoy that grind, the relics are a way for them to engage with more optional content like Eureka or Boja. Endwalker is a bit of an exception to this, but they can't all be winners. The AR version that started it all has always been seen as grindy, having been even worse back when it was initially released due to lower job chances of things like Atma and light rewards, involving many facets of the game that players didn't always want to engage with in excess. I personally appreciate the breadth of content it requires players to go through to complete solo. For players who don't enjoy battle content, there's always big fishing, which is a whole other world of 14 that many players don't fully understand. Even after all this time, players are still learning new things about the systems, and with continued updates and new fish being added, the fishers are always being tested in new ways that keep it fresh and exciting. Having done all of them on my main and working through them again on patchlock, fishing is both a joy and a pain, as it does still suffer from some flaws as RNG determines everything about it. The changes have helped to minimize it over time, but they still persist in ways that can make it frustrating, especially with the limited older kits. That patience wasn't even a button back in 2.4, so nothing to help with catching moochfish like Kuno the Killer. I don't even want to dream of what catching those fish was like. But the thrill of reeling in that fish after hours of work is almost unmatched. For the Shadowbringers Legends, it felt on par with clearing my first ultimate. Even with all this breadth of content released back in ARR, there is still a subset of players that insist others should skip over the expansion. Constant things new players see are forum post after forum post, message after message of players saying to skip. Either mash over it, playing through it with mind glazed over and not paying any attention to what's happening around them, or pay for a story skip. They don't see ARR as an important piece of the game's building blocks. Is it a fair approach to have? Should a new player who has never touched the game before skip over all of this content? While ARR does have some flaws, with the story being weak in large sections and the older content not necessarily holding up to modern standards, it lays a groundwork for players both narratively and mechanically that is built upon continuously through the current expansion. I would always recommend players experience all of it at least once. In defense of ARR, the story in itself is good. It has a complete narrative of character growth for the player into their role as the Warrior of Light. We managed to unite Eorzea, bringing together nations that have been broken apart for years, and defeat a foe they perceived as indomitable since the Calamity. Looking at ARR from above as an overarching narrative, it is a strong story that is worth experiencing even alone. There are slow moments, of course, and it could do with a bit of polishing and reworking, but it does still hold up today. Still, ARR is a major blocking point for those new players. It's not 2013 anymore, it's 2026. Square should update ARR so that it's more current and feels less like an old MMO, and hopefully an update to the MSQ can bring that out more. As Square is looking to improve the game more and more, there's probably something worth looking into so more people can fall in love with the game like the rest of us. It could take a lot of time and development, but would be worth it in the long run for the game's longevity. Despite being called the Great Filter, ARR's story is not nearly as bad as people commonly make it out to be. Sure, the introduction is slow and clunky, but if players can stick it out, it blossoms into a great narrative for the beginning of this epic journey. Taking ARR into account in full, I can now address the second point. Is it healthy for the game to allow players to skip to the current expansion? Is it okay for new players to be immediately dropped into harder modern content? And how could it be implemented to minimize the effect? Sure, players can already get job or story skips, but there are financial disincentives to do it now. Square put a paywall between skipping to the latest expansion, and it is a significant paywall too. Further to this, taking the comments from Yoshi P previously into account, and instead of focusing on skipping just just ARR, going all the way to the latest expansion, if the skip was available for free for any player that just started playing 14, would this have a net negative effect on the game? A lot of current players may scoff at the thought of skipping the story, but let's put some things into perspective first. The grand scale of the story after having 6 total expansions means an incredible time investment to get through. Conservatively estimating how long players could take to finish the story is around 500 to 600 hours, with more or less being dependent on playstyle and how much optional content they choose to engage with. That is a long time just to get caught up. For some prospective players, they may just want to get to modern content to play with their friends as quickly as possible, ignoring the story entirely. The Race to World First, Ultimate and Savage rating, these are all huge advertisements for the game that have so many players getting involved. New players wanting to do those things have to either sit through that entire intro or pay $50 US, 25 each for the story skip and a job skip to the start of Dawn Trail, and the 20 to 30 hours to get to the end of it, which are both tall asks for someone wanting to just get into raiding. Not to say I'm in favor of the cash shop's pricing, but this acts as a strong deterrent to skipping. Telling someone the raiding in the game is amazing, but comes with a potential multi-month time investment, slogging through irrelevant content, or a substantial financial one, they would likely turn away at the prospect. Being able to skip all of it is a way to allow these kinds of players to engage immediately with the content they desire, bringing more people into the game than would otherwise play. This does come with a fair share of downsides, however, as those players would also skip the entirety of the game's mechanical tutorials from doing previous content and learning their jobs over the entirety of that playtime. While this may not affect players who are coming from other MMOs, as a lot of the mechanical ability can likely carry over, it would be a major hindrance to brand new players with no backgrounds of any kind, as the learning curve is extremely steep when dropped in at 90 or 100 after Evercold releases. A new player would be heavily incentivized to skip, even if new to MMOs. The journey is daunting and players don't want to do the old stuff, but explore the new and fresh content that has the largest player base. Sure, Coils has some players, as I regularly see a few PFs up for them, but they are incredibly niche compared to the hundreds of listings for Modern, Savage, or Ultimates. Given these options, would I want to sit through all of this dead content or join in with everyone else? I definitely can't say I wouldn't want to skip, and I bet the general MMO player base would skip it, as while it is a major selling point of 14, it's not what these players would care about, as the battle content is where they get to engage proactively. To compensate for all of this, the game would need to force these players into in-depth tutorials for their job mechanics, their role responsibilities, and a deeper training than Hall of the Novice for commonly seen mechanics. Those players would need to be trained up to understand the basics they skip over, and all the building of those mechanics over the many hundreds of hours they would have played for. Even today, how many sprouts do you see on a regular basis run away with a stack marker? As of the day of recording this, I saw it twice yesterday. Imagine that player in a level 100 dungeon or raid. They'd be in way over their heads. Just imagine that kind of player tackling Valley Garmonda and being overwhelmed by all the icons and effects they haven't seen before and dying on repeat. Even recording the footage for this bit, players were still dying left and right, despite this content being out for over 2 years now. These weren't even new players either. They all had multiple jobs leveled to 100. Valley Garmonda isn't the peak of difficulty, but if players are struggling with this, how will brand new players handle content in Evercold if Square steps up the difficulty again? Think of the basics learned from simple fights such as Ifrit, Titan, and Garuda. Dodge AoEs, avoid proximities, look at the boss for tells, handling ads, etc. If a tutorial was implemented, it would have to cover every single type of mechanic in some way to allow these players to learn these things concretely. I definitely think it is possible to do, but it would take a lot of development time to make and refine to not feel overbearing or drawn out. With Evercold just a few months away and Tokyo Fan Fest just around the corner, as the developers implement changes to make the game fit better into a more modern era, it's hard not to feel like ARR is a weight they can't escape, bogging down the entire experience. While we've discussed its merits and it's not the worst experience to go through, it gates a lot of new players from truly seeing what this game has to offer, in both story and combat, filtering them out right at the starting line. To answer the original question, is ARR a bad expansion? Absolutely not, but it could definitely use some attention to bring it up to the modern standard. There's a lot to love in ARR, with so many amazing things introduced in the game's most experimental time. In a way, an experimental approach is probably what we need going into Evercold to shake things up. Thanks for watching the video. I know this is a bit of a departure from my normal content, again, but it felt like a good time to discuss it. It's been on my mind for a bit with Evercold coming soon and having spent so long in A Realm Reborn. I've had a lot of time to reflect on what the expansion has to offer, but I'd also like to hear from you guys. Feel free to leave me your thoughts in the comments below. And as for patch lock, this video was supposed to be a quick thing to do since the next episode is taking a bit to get done, but then this turned into a week-long endeavor. Sorry about that. Patch lock will continue, of course, and I hope you all look forward to that video coming soon. I just ask you be patient as we finish it up. See you all then.